Picture this. A woman stands in the hot sand of Rome's amphitheater, her skin already glistening with sweat. The roar of 50,000 voices crashes over her like a wave. But she's not wearing the protective gear of a male fighter. She has no helmet. Her face must be visible. Her arms are armored only at the sleeves. Her chest is completely bare. From the packed seats above, thousands of men lean forward, their eyes fixated not just on her fighting ability, but on her exposed body moving through combat. She's one of the Gladiatrix, Rome's most celebrated and most reviled warriors. And what you're about to learn about her world challenges everything we think we know about the ancient arena. The female gladiator of ancient Rome didn't emerge from military tradition or inherited warrior culture. She emerged from a calculated system designed to shock, to titillate, and most importantly, to remind every woman watching that her body belonged to the state and could be weaponized for entertainment. The term gladiatrix itself is modern scholarship's invention, a retrospective label applied centuries after these women's deaths. In ancient Rome, they were simply called ludia, performers, a word that blurred the line between entertainer and prostitute so deliberately that it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins. And that blurring was intentional. The practice of arming women for public combat didn't emerge as a spontaneous decision. It appeared during the reign of the Emperor Nero, the man known for poisoning his mother, strangling his pregnant wife, and kicking her corpse down the stairs. In 66 AD, Nero hosted games in the city of Puteoli to impress King Tiridates IV of Armenia. That day, Ethiopian women he controlled, women who had no choice, were forced into the arena not to demonstrate their martial prowess, but to demonstrate Rome's absolute power over the feminine form. These weren't warriors, they were objects of spectacle. They were proof that Rome could take even the most vulnerable, even women themselves, and commodify their bodies for entertainment. The crowd didn't cheer for their skill. They chanted for the exposure of flesh. They came to witness the transgression. What made this system work so effectively was how it exploited the contradiction at the heart of Roman society. Roman women of the upper classes were supposed to embody virtue, chastity, domesticity, submission. A respectable woman sat at home, tended to her children, managed her household. She was invisible. She was property. But the moment a woman entered the arena, she stepped outside that system of control entirely. And Rome's response was to weaponize her defiance. Rather than simply forbid women from fighting, emperors understood something far more sophisticated. A woman fighting in public was so transgressive that the spectacle of her transgression itself became erotic. The scandal was the appeal. The evidence for this calculated manipulation appears in the regulations surrounding female fighters. Women who appeared in the arena were required by law to be infames, a legal designation meaning they had lost all social standing. They were grouped with prostitutes, criminals, and slaves. An upper-class woman could technically be convicted as an infamia simply for appearing in the arena, a punishment that extended far beyond the games themselves. But this created a perverse incentive structure. For lower-class women, for enslaved women, for women with nothing to lose, the arena offered something unprecedented: fame, wealth, and freedom from complete subjugation. You could enter the games and retire with wealth that would take a peasant woman a lifetime of agricultural labor to accumulate. You could win sponsorships, gifts, adulation. You could control your body and your fate in a society where women controlled virtually nothing. This contradiction attracted women to the arena precisely because the system was so totalizing in its control elsewhere. Between the rigid expectations of upper-class virtue and the absolute servitude of enslaved women, there existed almost no space for female autonomy. But in the arena, there was a loophole. You could be displayed, commodified, sexualized, yes, but you could also be seen. You could have agency. You could win. The price was your permanent social degradation. The reward was wealth and freedom. For many women, it was a bargain they were willing to make. The training these women underwent followed the same brutal regimen as their male counterparts, but with one crucial difference. Male gladiators trained in closed schools, ludus facilities hidden from public view. Their bodies were vessels for technique, skill, and strategic combat. Female gladiators, by contrast, trained semi-publicly, their exertion and physical development visible to potential audiences even before they stepped into the arena. This wasn't about maximizing their martial abilities. It was about building anticipation. Audiences wanted to see how these women's bodies transformed through training. The muscle definition, the scars accumulating on their exposed skin, the visible toll of combat preparation. The training itself became part of the spectacle, and the spectacle was deliberately constructed to emphasize eroticism in ways that male gladiatorial combat never was. The poet Juvenal, writing in the 1st century AD, captures the crowd's reaction with barely concealed disgust and fascination. He describes a woman named Mevia hunting boars in the arena with spear in hand and breasts exposed, and the roar of male spectators ogling her body as she moved. Another passage mocks the wealthy patron whose wife had sold off her armor to become a fighter, his shame and pride somehow mingling at the spectacle of his wife's naked combat. The language suggests a deep cultural anxiety. These were women violating fundamental social codes, and Romans were paying money to watch them do it. The weapons and attire confirmed this erotic framing. Unlike male gladiators, who wore helmets that covered their faces, female fighters appeared bareheaded. Their identities had to remain visible. This was crucial. The arena needed to know who these women were, to follow them as personalities, to develop attachments to their bodies and faces. Male fighters could hide behind their armor and be transformed into archetypes, the Thracian, the Retiarius. Female fighters were exposed as individuals. Their stage names were references to Amazon mythology, those half-legendary female warriors who haunted Greek consciousness as both seductive and dangerous. There was Amazon and Achillea, names that evoked mythological authority while simultaneously marking them as freaks, as aberrations from nature. The armor itself was a tool of humiliation. A marble relief from Halicarnassus, now preserved in the British Museum, shows two female gladiators named Amazon and Achillea facing off against each other. They wear loincloths and arm protections, yes, but their breasts are completely bare, their heads uncovered. What's remarkable about this relief isn't the fighting technique depicted, it's what's absent. Near their feet, removed and placed prominently, are their helmets. In the world of gladiatorial symbolism, removing your helmet meant the fight was over, victory was achieved. But what the relief actually documents is something stranger and more calculated. It shows the moment when these women, having fought, are identified. Their faces become the trophies. Their bodies become the evidence of the spectacle. This visibility extended to a realm that male gladiators largely escaped. Roman society had a word for women of the arena. The satirists and moralists used it interchangeably with prostitute. The line between fighter and sex worker blurred so thoroughly that many female gladiators likely engaged in both forms of labor. And this wasn't accidental. emperors and arena sponsors understood that allowing women to fight in public established them as available for viewing, available for purchase, available for use beyond the arena itself. The spectacle of combat was continuous with the spectacle of commercialized sexuality. The control extended to every detail of their physical presentation. A bronze statue from the Roman period, studied extensively by archaeologists, depicts a female gladiator in the moment of victory, her arm raised with what's believed to be a sica, a curved gladiatorial sword. But what's most revealing about this statue is her complete nudity except for a bandage around her knee, a standard feature of gladiatorial injury. The sculptor chose to memorialize her in this state, half-clothed, wounded, triumphant, exposed. She's frozen in the moment between violence and display, between combat and commodification. This wasn't coincidental artistic choice. This was documentation of how Rome understood the female fighter's body as permanently available for viewing, evaluation, and consumption. The timing of female gladiatorial combat within the games reveals the most crucial aspect of how this system functioned. The games were divided into carefully orchestrated sections. Morning hunts featured wild animal encounters, venations that served as warm-up spectacle. Midday brought executions and comedies, lighter entertainment to amuse the crowd and break up the bloodier spectacles. But female gladiatorial combat. Historical sources indicate these fights took place in mid-afternoon, during the same time slots as the most prestigious male gladiatorial matches. They weren't novelties relegated to the margins. They were premier events, treated as seriously as the contests featuring the arena's most celebrated male fighters. This placement confirms that female gladiators weren't trivial entertainments. They were significant spectacles that generated enormous revenue and drew large crowds. Yet the moral framework surrounding them remained one of scandal and degradation. The Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, hosted spectacular games featuring female fighters, and contemporary writers record his fascination with creating seemingly impossible matchups. According to Suetonius, Domitian orchestrated fights pitting women against dwarfs, creating grotesque spectacles of mismatch and humiliation. The source material doesn't celebrate this. It records it with a tone of appalled fascination, documenting the decline of Roman moral standards through the spectacle of female combat. But Domitian understood something crucial: scandal sells. The controversy around female gladiators was part of what made them so valuable as entertainment. This controversy intensified because female gladiators directly challenged the fundamental basis of Roman social order. The patriarchy didn't simply require women to be subordinate, it required them to be visibly subordinate. Women's inferiority had to be performed, demonstrated, embodied. A woman wearing armor, wielding weapons, training in martial skills, threatened this system at its core. She represented the possibility that physical strength and martial prowess weren't inherently male attributes. She represented the possibility that women could transcend their prescribed roles, and Rome's response was to weaponize that transgression, make her more exposed, make the spectacle more scandalous, make her degradation more public and more eroticized, control her through the very mechanisms that seemed to empower her. The legal framework surrounding female gladiators became increasingly restrictive precisely because the practice threatened fundamental assumptions about gender and power. In 11 AD, the Roman Senate passed a law forbidding free-born women under 20 from participating in gladiatorial games. This wasn't simply a moral prohibition. It was a legal recognition that women were participating in significant enough numbers to warrant regulation. The law targeted free-born women specifically, which implies that enslaved women and women of the lowest social classes were still allowed to fight. The distinction reveals what truly concerned Rome's legislators, not female combat itself, but the idea of respectable women transgressing their assigned roles. Upper-class women had more to lose: their social position, their marriage prospects, their claims to respectability. Lower-class women had almost nothing, which meant the system of control through social shame had limited purchase over them. They could be freed by fighting, and Rome recognized this as a threat. By the time the Emperor Septimius Severus took power in the early 3rd century AD, the accumulated pressure against female gladiators had become overwhelming. In 200 AD, he issued an edict banning all women, regardless of social class, from fighting in the arena. The justification recorded by the historian Cassius Dio reveals the true target of this prohibition. Severus, Dio records, was outraged not simply by female combat itself, but by the spectacle it had created. At an athletic contest featuring women, the crowd had engaged in ribald chants and sexual commentary about the female athletes. Their behavior had become so uncontrolled, so sexualized, that Severus interpreted it as a threat to social order. Women in athletic competition had apparently inspired spectators to make obscene jokes about women in general. This sexual degradation had tainted the concept of womanhood itself. What makes this justification so revealing is that Severus doesn't frame the ban as protecting women. He frames it as protecting Rome's ability to maintain control over women. The problem wasn't that women were being humiliated and exploited in the arena. The problem was that the spectacle of humiliation had spiraled beyond what could be managed. The jokes had become too ribald. The crowds had become too excited. The spectacle of female transgression had taken on a life of its own that even the emperor couldn't fully control. And that loss of control was intolerable. Severus's ban effectively ended the era of female gladiators in the official games, though it likely didn't stop the practice entirely. An inscription from Ostia, dated to the mid to late 2nd century AD, commemorates a magistrate named Hostilianus as the first person to provide women fighters in that city's games since its founding. If this inscription dates after Severus's ban, it suggests that some regions found ways to circumvent the prohibition, particularly by using lower-class women, muliers, rather than feminae, whose participation wouldn't technically violate the restrictions on respectable women. But the ban itself marked a symbolic endpoint. Within little more than a century, the practice of using women as gladiatorial combat had emerged, flourished, and been officially prohibited. In that relatively brief span, thousands of women had fought, bled, died, and survived in Roman arenas. Some achieved fame, some achieved wealth, some achieved freedom, but all of them achieved permanent social degradation. The infamia designation followed them for the rest of their lives. A female gladiator who retired wealthy was still a gladiator, an object of scandal, a woman who had sold her body and honor for spectacle. Yet the evidence suggests that some of these women found ways to transform that degradation into something else. A woman's tomb has been discovered in a cemetery outside the Roman Colosseum, the grave of a fighter in her 20s. Her remains were surrounded with tributes, oil lamps bearing her image, inscriptions praising her skills, medals and trinkets documenting her victories. She had been buried with honors unusual for her time, suggesting that her community understood her as something more than a mere gladiator. Despite her legal status as infames, despite the scandal of her fighting, she had achieved a kind of immortality. Someone, perhaps admirers, perhaps fans, perhaps people who had watched her fight, had taken the time and expense to commemorate her achievements. She had been remembered. In a society that worked so systematically to make women invisible, that was its own kind of victory. What we see in the history of the Gladiatrix is a system of control, so sophisticated that it transformed apparent transgression into deeper subjugation. Women who escaped the confines of domestic life by entering the arena found themselves subject to an even more totalizing system of visibility and commodification. Their bodies were no longer private property belonging to individual men. They became public property, available for viewing, judgment, and consumption by the masses. The freedom they sought through combat turned into a different kind of captivity. Yet within those constraints, these women made choices. They risked their lives. They fought. They sometimes won. And in an empire that tolerated women almost exclusively as invisible, obedient, domestic presences, they forced themselves to be seen. The gladiatrix represented something Rome could never quite resolve. A woman who refused to be contained, even as she was being systematically exploited. She embodied a contradiction that threatened the foundations of Roman society, which is precisely why she was so dangerous and why she was eventually eradicated from official spectacle. Her erasure from history is itself part of the system that created her, a system that thrives not just on explicit control, but on the power to determine what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. That these women have been almost entirely forgotten, that their names survive only on a handful of inscriptions, that their stories have been reduced to footnotes in histories of male gladiators, that forgetting is the final humiliation and the final testament to just how complete the ancient system of control really was.